Hi everyone, welcome back to part 2 of Rethinking Listening. Okay, so before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Sydney campuses stand and pay my respects to those who have cared and continue to care for country. Okay, so what will I learn in this lecture? We're going to be thinking critically about listening again. We're going to be discussing some more philosophical ideas, this time focusing on the physicality of sound. Okay, so let's think about how we hear. Sound waves travel into our ear canals, into the cochlea, and then they are processed by the brain. So sound is very literally internalized, and in this process, it changes our bodies. We interpret this sound, we decode its meaning, and this often produces emotion. It's this chain of events that become what's known as affect. So this idea is called affect in philosophy, but it's not entirely dissimilar to biomusicology, though that is much, much more specific and also scientific in approach. So Anahit Kasabian's book, Ubiquitous Listening, provides a really thorough definition of what affect is. In this book, she describes it as the circuit of bodily responses to stimuli that take place before conscious apprehension. This book is super interesting. Here, she's asking, what do all these sounds do at varying levels of attention? We are, especially those of us that live in the city, constantly surrounded by sounds. This kind of domestic household symphony that Barthes was talking about is actually pretty noisy. But in contemporary life, we're also all too often surrounded by music, which is a largely 20th century problem. The advent of the hi-fi, the Walkman, the Discman, the iPod, and most recently iPhone has really changed the way that we listen, particularly to music. Previously, prior to all this, the only way to hear a piece of music was to be in the same room as the performer. While today, music is often employed by shops to impact the way we move throughout the store. And let's not forget all the stuff we discussed in our lecture and tutorials last week as well. So Anahit Kasabian takes quite a different definition of listening to Roland Barthes. She describes it much more broadly as a range of engagements between and across human bodies and music technologies, whether those technologies be voices, instruments, sound systems, iPods, or other listening devices. She says that listening is most importantly physiological, and that many kinds of listening take place over a wide range of degrees or kinds of consciousness and attention. So this is a really interesting shift from Roland Barthes' definition, where hearing and listening were two separate things. Kasabian is saying that everything is listening, and it's whether we're paying attention to it or not, it's still listening. It's still impacting our bodies, which is a really interesting shift. And I think speaks a lot more to contemporary ways of listening, thinking about how we're consuming sound in shops, through our devices, all of these things all the time. So this idea of touch and a physiological listening is really important here. Let me just make myself a little bit smaller. Okay, so Evelyn Glennie says that, who's an amazing percussionist, there we go, hearing is basically a specialized form of touch. Sound is simply vibrating air which the ear picks up and converts to electrical signals, which are then interpreted by the brain. The sense of hearing is not the only sense that can do this. Touch can do this too. For some reason, we tend to make a distinction between hearing a sound and feeling of a vibration. In reality, they are the same thing. This is quite an interesting thing to think about. Sorry, my production values are not quite as good as Liam's usually are. So So what Kasabian and also Evelyn Glennie are arguing is that we listen in a predominantly corporeal manner. And I believe that this is evidenced further by the proliferation of mood-based like chill playlists on streaming services. It's really merging Bartz's idea that listening and hearing are two separate things. And Kasabian's focus on affect, this physical response to sound, and the intelligence of the body really circumvents a need to kind of cognify or understand this kind of psychological act that Barthes talks about. But it still becomes an issue of attention. So a really interesting example of this in music is this piece by Brian Eno, Ambient One, Music for Airports. I'm sure at least some of you have heard of this piece. In this piece, Eno is using music to create a very specific physical response. There are a couple of origin stories, but one is that he was really unwell and let the record kind of skip for too long, and really noticed how this was making him feel. He wrote music for airports because he's very afraid of flying, and he wanted something that would change that. Another example of the physicality of sound is the sound design that Gaspar No used in their film Irreversible. No uses infrasound, which is sounds that are so low, below 20 hertz, I believe, that they can't actually be heard as pitched noise by the listener, but instead they're felt physically. It's like a thriller horror movie, and the sound designer put these in place because they create a very specific physical response. So why is this relevant? When we're talking about designing for a car, it's important to think through how the sound design will create an environment within the car, and also how it will make the driver feel. This dichotomy between listening and hearing can illuminate a lot about the experience for the driver. And also thinking about that different ways of physically experiencing sound. Where is the driver's attention being pulled, and where should it be? These are really important safety considerations as well. And finally, chances are the driver will be listening to the radio, to a Spotify playlist, talking on the phone. Can our sound design exist alongside this too? Okay, so here's my cool story. Did you know that many places that are thought to be haunted often just have air conditioning units or similar appliances that are producing a low frequency sound? An infrasound like Gaspar No was using that is unable to be heard by humans, but the vibrations are actually felt. So this infrasound can create a sense of nausea and unease, a general feeling of discomfort, aka an extremely spooky feeling. Some say it can even make your vision blur momentarily, like you might have seen a ghost. So next time you're in a haunted house, check that aircon first. Okay, thanks everyone. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you soon.